The Ashworth family needed an heir within 30 days, or they would lose everything. So they found me. I want to be precise about that word, found, because it is the first lie in a story that is made almost entirely of lies, and I should know, because I can see every single one of them. They did not find me. They hired me. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole story. Let me start with what I am, because you will not understand anything that follows otherwise. My name is Quinn Maddox, and I have a strange and uncomfortable talent. I can tell when a person is lying. Not by guessing, not by intuition, but by watching. There is a flicker that crosses a human face in the quarter second before a lie, a tiny betrayal in the eyes, the mouth, the muscles no one can fully control. Most people miss it. I never do. I have never once, in my entire life, been able to not see it. It made my childhood lonely, because children lie constantly and I always knew. It made my adult life complicated, because I could not sit across from a man at dinner and not see the moment he lied about where he had been. It made me eventually a very good reader of rooms and a very poor truster of people, and it landed me at 28 doing quiet contract work for lawyers and negotiators who paid well for a woman who could sit in a meeting and tell them afterward exactly who had lied and when. Which is how the Ashworths found me, or rather, how their lawyer did. The Ashworth fortune was one of those old, vast, complicated American fortunes, the kind tied up in trusts and conditions written 100 years ago by people who never imagined the family they were trying to protect. And the central condition, the one that mattered, was this. The bulk of the estate could only pass to a direct blood descendant of the founder. No direct heir, and the entire fortune would pass instead to a side branch of the family, a cousin's line, in 30 days. The matriarch, Cordelia Ashworth, 80 years old and sharp as broken glass, had one direct grandchild, a granddaughter, lost 20 years ago when her parents died, and the child vanished into the foster system after a clerical catastrophe. Cordelia had been searching for that lost granddaughter for 20 years, and she had run out of time. 30 days from the reading of a clock I did not yet understand, the fortune would slip to the cousin's branch, to a man named Spencer Ashworth, unless the lost granddaughter was found. So a lawyer came to me, and he made me an offer, and here is where I should have walked away. "We have found the granddaughter," he said. "Her name is Quinn. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence? You even share her name." He smiled. "The family simply needs someone to step into the role while the final paperwork is verified. A formality. You resemble her closely. You'll be well compensated. Think of it as the easiest acting job of your life." He was lying. I watched it cross his face, clear as a flare in the dark. There was no found granddaughter. There was no remarkable coincidence about the name. Every word of what he had just said was a construction, and I saw the construction the way you would see a man building a wall out of cards in front of you. I should have walked away. I want to be honest about why I didn't. The money was extraordinary, more than I had ever been offered. And underneath that, something colder and more curious. Because if there was no real granddaughter, then someone was running an enormous, intricate lie. And I have spent my whole life watching liars from the outside, alone, unable to do anything but see. For once, I thought, I would be on the inside of the lie. I would let them think I was their puppet, their hired heir, their convenient fiction, and I would watch every single one of them and find out what was really happening to the Ashworth fortune and who was really lying and why. So I looked the lawyer in the eye, and I told my own first lie, the only kind I am any good at, which is the lie of a blank, agreeable face. "When do I start?" I said. They brought me to the Ashworth estate 3 days later, and I walked into a house where almost everyone was lying about almost everything, and I could see all of it at once. It was, I will admit, overwhelming. Like walking into a room where everyone is shouting in a language only you can hear. Cordelia Ashworth received me in a vast drawing room, seated very straight in a chair that was almost a throne. She was tiny and ancient, and her eyes were the sharpest I had ever seen. And when they fixed on me, I had the unfamiliar and deeply unsettling experience of feeling red in return. "So," she said, "you are Quinn." And here's the thing that stopped my heart, just slightly, in that first moment. When she said it, when she looked at me and called me Quinn and waited, Cordelia Ashworth was not lying. But she was not telling the truth either. Her face did something I almost never saw, something I had no clean category for. She was testing. She said my name the way you place a piece on a board to see how your opponent responds. This old woman knew something, and she was watching me as carefully as I was watching her, and the realization sent a thin, cold thread of warning through me. I had walked in assuming I was the only one in the house who could see. I was already, in the first 30 seconds, less sure. "Yes," I said, "I'm Quinn." That at least was true. It was the one true thing I could offer, and I offered it, and I watched her note that I had not flinched. The rest of the family was arranged around the room like a portrait of polite hostility, and as the introductions went around, I read them one by one, the way another person might read name tags. There was Spencer Ashworth, the cousin, the man who stood to inherit everything if I failed to be convincing. He was handsome and warm, and he shook my hand and said how wonderful it was that the lost granddaughter had been found at last, how the whole family was overjoyed. He was lying. Of course he was lying. He was lying about being overjoyed, lying about being welcoming, and underneath it, in the set of his jaw, was something I filed away carefully. He was not surprised by me. A man whose inheritance had just been snatched away by a long-lost heir should be shocked, furious, suspicious. Spencer was none of those things. Spencer was performing surprise he did not feel, which meant Spencer already knew I was coming, which meant Spencer was not the victim of this fake heir. Spencer was in on it. I tucked that away. There was the lawyer, Ross Calder, the one who had hired me, lying smoothly and continuously the way some men breathe. There were assorted cousins and aunts, a fog of minor deceptions, and there was a man named Theo who managed the estate's affairs, quiet and watchful at the edge of the room, and when he was introduced and said simply, "Welcome to the house, Ms. Ashworth," I felt a small, strange shock. He wasn't lying. In a house roaring with falsehood, Theo had said 4 true words. It was so rare that it stood out like a single clear note in a wall of noise. I looked at him a half-second longer than I meant to, and he looked back, and neither of us said anything, and I filed that away too. I had come into this house believing I understood the shape of the lie. The family needed a fake heir. I would play the fake heir. I would watch and learn and be paid. But on my first evening, reading the room, I already knew it was more tangled than that. Cordelia was testing me, not fooling me. Spencer was a conspirator, not a victim. And somewhere underneath all of it was the question that would drive everything that followed. The question I could not yet answer, even with a gift that saw every lie. If they hired me to be a granddaughter who does not exist, then what happened to the real one? Cordelia Ashworth tested me the next morning, and it was the most dangerous conversation of my life, because I could not tell what she already knew. She summoned me to breakfast, alone, just the two of us at a long table, and she watched me the entire time with those terrible, sharp eyes. "Tell me about your childhood," she said. It was a trap, and we both knew it. I had been given a file, a fabricated history of the lost granddaughter, names and places and dates I was supposed to have memorized. Ross Calder had built me a past. If I recited it, I would be reciting a lie to the one woman in the house who seemed able to feel a lie, even if she couldn't see it the way I could. So I made a decision that surprised even me. "I'm not going to tell you the story they gave me," I said. Cordelia's cup paused, very slightly, on its way to her lips. "I have a file," I said. A whole childhood, written by your lawyer. I memorized it. I could recite it to you right now, and it would be word perfect, but you'd know. I don't know how you'd know, but you would. You've been watching me since I walked in the way I watch everyone, and I think you and I are, in some strange way, the same kind of animal. So, I'm not going to perform the file for you. I'm going to tell you something true instead. I set down my own cup. I don't know whose granddaughter I am, but I'm not yours. We both know that. The question I find more interesting is why a woman as sharp as you would let your lawyer hire a fake one when you can clearly tell she's fake. The silence stretched out very long. And then Cordelia Ashworth did something I did not expect. She laughed, a dry, cracked, genuine laugh, and for the first time since I had entered the house, her face was completely, restfully honest. "Oh," she said, "you're much better than they think you are. They told me you were a desperate actress who would read the file and collect a check." She set down her cup. "You are not that at all, are you? You see things." "I see when people lie," I said. It seemed pointless to hide it now. I've seen it my whole life. I can't turn it off. Cordelia studied me with open, naked interest. "Then you are the most useful person who has walked into this house in 20 years, she said, and she leaned forward. "So let me tell you a true thing, Quinn, since you've offered me one. I know you are not my granddaughter. I have known since you walked in. I let Calder hire you anyway. And do you know why? Because I wanted to see who you really were before I told you the truth. And here it is. I did not hire a fake heir because I gave up on finding my real one." She fixed me with those sharp old eyes. "I hired a fake heir to flush out the people who made my real one disappear." The cold thread of warning in my chest pulled tight. "You think she's alive?" I said slowly. "The real granddaughter." "I think," Cordelia Ashworth said, "that 20 years ago, someone in this family made sure she vanished so that the fortune would one day fall to them. And I think that bringing a fake granddaughter into this house, dangling 30 days and an entire fortune in front of them, will make the guilty ones panic and move and show themselves." She smiled, thin and dangerous. "I needed bait, Quinn, but it turns out I have hired something far better than bait. I have hired someone who can watch them panic and see exactly which of them is lying." I sat there at that long table, and I understood that I had walked into something vastly larger than an acting job. "Will you help me?" the old woman asked. "Not as a fake heir, as my eyes. We have 30 days. Help me find out what they did to my granddaughter, and who. And God help me." I said yes. "Let me tell you how I came to be the way I am, because it matters to what we found. I was not born into houses like the Ashworths. I was born into an ordinary, struggling family. And the thing that shaped me was not money, but a single fact. My mother lied, constantly and beautifully, and I could always tell. She lied about small things and large ones. She lied about where the money went, and whether she was coming back, and whether she loved the men she left us for. And from the time I was very small, I could see it, the flicker, the tell, the quarter-second betrayal before each lie left her mouth. I did not have words for it as a child. I only knew that my mother's face said two things at once, and that everyone around me seemed to hear only the spoken one while I saw the other. It is a terrible gift to give a child, the ability to see every lie an adult tells her. I grew up unable to be comforted by the small, kind lies that make childhood bearable. When my mother said everything would be fine, I saw that she did not believe it. When people said they would come back, I saw the ones who were already gone. So I learned to watch and to say nothing, and to keep what I saw locked behind a blank, agreeable face. I became invisible the way the watchful learn to be invisible. And I grew up into a woman who could not be lied to, and therefore, in a strange way, could not be close to anyone, because intimacy requires the small mercy of sometimes not seeing. I had made a careful, lonely peace with it. I used it for work, I kept it from everyone else. I had never, until the Ashworths, met a single person who knew what it was to see what I saw. And now I was in a house with an 80-year-old woman who, in her own way, saw almost as much as I did, and who had pointed my gift like a weapon at her own family. We worked quietly, Cordelia and I, over the days that followed. She would arrange conversations, gatherings, small tests, putting members of the family in front of me, and afterward I would tell her what I had seen. Who lied when Spencer's name came up? Who flinched at the mention of the lost granddaughter? Who was merely greedy? And who was hiding something darker? And slowly, out of 100 tiny tells, a shape began to form. Spencer Ashworth was at the center of it. I had known that from the first handshake. But Spencer was not alone. The lawyer, Ross Calder, lied differently when Spencer was in the room, more carefully, like a man protecting a partner. And there was a third person, someone whose name kept surfacing in the flinches and the silences, someone who had been present 20 years ago when a little girl vanished. The more we looked, the clearer it became. The disappearance of the real Quinn Ashworth had not been a clerical catastrophe at all. It had been arranged. A child had been made to vanish into the system, deliberately, by someone who knew that in 20 years, with no direct heir, the fortune would fall to the cousin's branch, to Spencer. He had played a 20-year game. He had made a 4-year-old disappear and then simply waited, patient as a stone, for the clock to run out. And he had almost won. He was 9 days from winning, when an old woman who saw too much hired a fake granddaughter to make him panic. The problem was that Spencer Ashworth did not panic easily. He was, I had to admit, very good. Almost as good at hiding as I was at seeing. But almost is the whole story. Because there is no one alive who can hide every tell, every time, from someone who has been watching faces since before she could read. And Spencer Ashworth was about to make exactly one mistake. The mistake came at a dinner, the way these things do. Cordelia had arranged it deliberately, a large family dinner, all of them around the long table, and she had done something cruel and brilliant in the invitation. She had let it be known that new information had surfaced about the lost granddaughter, that a lead, after 20 years, had finally come in, that she had reason to believe the real Quinn might still be alive and findable within the 30 days. It was a lie. Cordelia had no such lead, but she told it to the whole table, and I sat beside her, invisible as always, the fake granddaughter playing her quiet part, and I watched every single face in the room at the moment the words left Cordelia's mouth. Most of the family reacted the way innocent people react to surprising news. Curiosity, confusion, a flicker of worry about what a real heir would mean for them. Spencer Ashworth's face did something else entirely. For 1/4 of 1 second, before the warm mask came back down, Spencer Ashworth was afraid. Not surprised, not curious. Afraid, in the specific particular way of a man who has buried something and just heard a shovel hit the ground. His eyes went, for that fraction of a moment, to Ross Calder, the lawyer, across the table. A flash of pure alarm passing between them, and Ross Calder flinched back. In that single shared half-second, 2 men told me everything. They knew the real granddaughter was findable, because they knew where she had been put. They were not afraid of a hypothetical heir. They were afraid of a specific one, a real girl, a real location, a real trail that a real lead might uncover. The girl was alive, and Spencer and Calder knew where. I did not change my expression. I have spent my whole life not changing my expression. I passed the bread, and I asked someone to pass the water, and I let the dinner flow on around me. And underneath the table, my hands were perfectly still, and inside I was certain, for the first time, of the thing that mattered most. The real Quinn Ashworth was alive. After the dinner in Cordelia's study, I told her. "He knows where she is," I said. So does Calder. When you said she might be findable, they were not afraid of losing the money to a stranger. They were afraid of a specific place being searched. Wherever your granddaughter was put 20 years ago, Spencer knows the address, and the thought of someone going there terrifies him. Cordelia Ashworth, 80 years old, gripped the arm of her chair until her knuckles went white. 20 years, she whispered. 20 years I believed she was lost to the system, unfindable, perhaps dead. And he knew, all along. He has sat at my table every Christmas, knowing exactly where my granddaughter was. We have 9 days, I said. And we have the one thing they never accounted for. They built a 20-year lie on the certainty that no one could see them. She looked at me. They were wrong about one person in the room. We needed proof, and proof is different from seeing. This is the limit of my gift, and I have always known it. I can see that a man is lying. I cannot prove it. I cannot walk into a courtroom and say, I watched his face and I know. My certainty lives behind my own eyes, and it has never once been worth anything to anyone but me. Because the world runs on evidence, not on the testimony of a woman who claims she can read faces. So to find the real Quinn, and to bring down the men who had hidden her, we needed more than my certainty. We needed the address, the trail, the documents, the real-world proof that matched the truth I could see. And for that, I turned to the one person in the house who had never lied to me. Theo, the estate manager. The man who had said 4 true words on my first night. I had been watching him for days, the way I watch everyone, and the strange fact remained. Theo did not lie. Not the small social lies everyone tells, not the convenient ones, not once. In a house built on falsehood, he was a single point of fixed truth, and I had come, slowly and against all my careful loneliness, to trust him. Because trusting him required no faith. I could simply see that he was honest. When I told him what Cordelia and I had found, he was quiet for a long moment. I've worked for this family for 9 years, he said finally, and I have always known something was wrong with the story of the lost granddaughter. The records around that time are a mess. Gaps. Documents that should exist and don't. I assumed it was old incompetence. He looked at me. You're telling me it was deliberate. I'm telling you Spencer made a 4-year-old disappear so he could inherit, I said, and that she's alive, and he knows where. I can see that he knows. I just can't prove it. That's where I need you. You have access to the estate's records, the old files, the financial trails, everything I can see. You can help me find the document for. Theo looked at me, and he made a decision I watched land honestly on his face. Then let's find your granddaughter, he said. The real one. We worked through the nights that followed, Theo and I, with Cordelia's authority opening every locked file. And it worked the way it had to work. I would tell Theo what I had seen, the flinch when a certain year was mentioned, the alarm at a certain word, and Theo would go into the records and find the thing my eyes had pointed at. A payment, 20 years old, from Spencer to a name none of us recognized. A falsified document moving a child through the system. A trail, faint and buried and deliberate, that matched, point for point, every lie I had watched cross Spencer Ashworth's face. And at the end of it, in a file that should not have existed, buried in a payment Spencer had been too arrogant to think anyone would ever trace, we found it. An address. Current. A woman, 24 years old now, living an ordinary life under an ordinary name. 3 states away, with no idea that she was the sole direct heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country, or that the family she had been stolen from had been looking for her for 20 years. We found her, Theo said quietly, staring at the screen. We found her, I said, and I felt something I had almost never felt in my life of seeing through everyone. I felt the clean, uncomplicated joy of a true thing, found at last, in a house full of lies. Spencer Ashworth. came to my room the night before the deadline, and he came to do what men like him always do when they sense the walls closing in. He came to make a deal. He was good. I will give him that to the end. He came in warm and reasonable, and he sat down across from me like an ally, and he began to lie with a fluency that would have fooled anyone in the world except me. "Quinn," he said. "Can I call you Quinn? It's funny. You almost feel like family now." He smiled. "I'm going to be honest with you." He was not going to be honest with me. The flicker came and went. "I know you're not really the granddaughter," he said. "We both know that. Calder hired you, you've played your part beautifully, and tomorrow the deadline passes and this all resolves itself. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. You've been a professional. I'd like to double what they're paying you, as a personal thank you. And then you can leave all this messy family business behind and never think about us again." It was a bribe, dressed as gratitude. He had sensed that I had become something more than a hired actress, that I was too close to Cordelia, too watchful, and he wanted me gone and silent before the deadline. And underneath the smooth offer, in the tightness around his eyes, I saw the fear again, the same fear from the dinner. He was not in control. He was scrambling. So I did something I had never done in my entire life. I told a liar, to his face, that I could see him. "Spencer," I said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully because I'm going to tell you something no one has ever told you. I can see when you lie, not guess. See? There's a thing your face does right here." He watched my finger. "A quarter second before every lie. And you've done it 11 times since you sat down. You did it when you said you wanted to take care of me. You did it when you called me family. And you did it, the biggest one of all, 20 years ago. Though I wasn't there to see that one." I leaned forward. "I know what you did to her, Spencer. I can't prove it with my eyes. But I don't have to anymore. Because we found her. I watched it land. I watched 20 years of careful control crack down the middle. I watched Spencer Ashworth's face, for one long, unguarded moment, show me the pure animal panic underneath, and it was, I will admit, the most satisfying thing my strange gift had ever shown me. "You're bluffing," he said, but his face said he knew I wasn't. "I'm never bluffing," I said. "That's the one thing I genuinely cannot do. Ask anyone who's ever played cards with me. She's 24, Spencer. She's alive. She's 3 states away. And tomorrow, she's coming home." He stood up so fast the chair fell. The mask was entirely gone now. And for just a moment I saw him calculate, the way cornered men calculate, whether there was anything left to do, any lie left to tell, any move left to make. There wasn't. And the worst part, for a man like Spencer, was that I could see him realize it. He left without another word, and I sat in the quiet, and I did not feel afraid. I felt, for the first time in a life spent watching liars get away with it, the thing I had never been able to feel. I felt the lie losing. She came home on the 30th day. I will not pretend I orchestrated the reunion, because I didn't. Cordelia and Theo, and an honest lawyer Cordelia trusted, had done the real work in those final days. The careful approach to a young woman 3 states away, the proof laid before her gently, the slow unfolding of a truth that would change her entire life. Her name was Quinn, too. The same name. Cordelia had named the fake after the real one, I learned. A small, deliberate cruelty aimed at the guilty. A name like a blade held to their throats for 30 days. The real Quinn Ashworth was 24, and she was bewildered and frightened and brave, and when she walked into the Ashworth house in Cordelia, Ashworth saw her granddaughter's face for the first time in 20 years. The old woman who saw through everyone simply broke and wept and held her, and there was not a single lie in the room. I stood at the edge of it, where I always stood, and I watched a true thing happen, and I did not look away. But there was still the matter of Spencer. Finding the real heir saved the fortune. It did not, by itself, prove what Spencer had done. My eyes had seen it. Theo's records had traced it. But the final proof, the thing that turned 20 years of my certainty into something the law could hold, came together in the days after, when the trail Theo and I had built was handed to people whose job it is to follow such trails properly. The payment to make a child disappear. The falsified documents. The 20-year trail of a man who had stolen a little girl's entire life so that a fortune would one day fall to him. Laid out, dated, documented, it was no longer the testimony of a woman who claimed she could read faces. It was a case. Spencer tried, at the end, to lie his way out, because lying was the only thing he had ever known how to do. He sat in rooms with serious people and told smooth, careful, fluent lies, and for the first time in his life it did not work, because the documents did not care about his face, and the woman who could see his face was no longer the only witness against him. What happened to Spencer Ashworth after that is a matter of record, handled by the proper people. He had built a 20-year scheme on the certainty that no one could see what he truly was. He had been seen the whole time. He just hadn't known it until the end. And Ross Calder, the lawyer who lied as easily as breathing, went down beside him because a trail that careful always has two sets of footprints. I want to tell you about the moment I think about most, though. It was small. It was after, when the real Quinn was beginning, slowly, to understand the family she had been stolen from, and she came to find me, the fake Quinn, the strange woman who had wandered through her family's lies for 30 days. "Why did you do it?" she asked me. "You didn't know me. You were just hired. Why did you keep going?" And I told her the truth, because she had earned it, and because I was tired of the only honest thing about me being a blank face. Because my whole life, I said, I've watched people lie and get away with it, and I could see it, and I could never do anything about it. I just had to watch. You were the first time the truth I saw could actually save someone. I wasn't going to look away from that. Not for any amount of money. I looked at her. You were the first lie I ever got to win against. Cordelia Ashworth offered me a place after. Not as a granddaughter, obviously. The granddaughter chair was filled now, gloriously, by a bewildered young woman learning to be an heir. But Cordelia offered me something else. "Stay," she said. "Be my eyes. There is no one in my life who sees the way you do. I could use you until the day I die and pay you a fortune, and never once have to wonder if someone is lying to me." It was a generous offer, and a lonely one, and I thought about it longer than you might expect. But I said no. I had spent my whole life as someone's hidden eyes, the watcher in the corner, the one who saw and said nothing, the lonely animal who could not be lied to and therefore could not be close to anyone. Cordelia's offer was a gilded version of the only life I had ever known. A lifetime of watching other people's lies, in a beautiful house, for a great deal of money alone. I didn't want it. I had finally learned, in that strange month, that there was something better I could do with the thing I am. I do a particular kind of work now. I work with people who have been lied to and lied about by someone more powerful than they are. The wrongly accused, the defrauded, the ones who know in their bones that they are being deceived and cannot prove it and cannot make anyone believe them. I sit in the rooms where they are being lied to, and I watch, and afterward I tell them exactly what I saw, and who lied, and when. And then, like Theo and I did in that house, we go and find the proof that the lie points to. My eyes are still only the map. They were always only the map, but I have learned that a map, in the right hands, with an honest person beside you to dig, can find the buried thing every time. Theo, as it happens, is often the honest person beside me. He left the Ashworth estate not long after I did. We work together now, the woman who sees every lie and the man who never tells one, and what we are to each other beyond that is still being written, slowly, in the only language I have ever fully trusted, which is the language of a face that means exactly what it says. People ask me sometimes, the few who know what I can do, whether it is a gift or a curse. For most of my life, I would have said curse without hesitating. A childhood with no comforting lies. An adulthood with no easy intimacy. A lifetime of seeing the worst of people in the quarter second before they hide it. I don't say curse anymore, because a family of liars spent 20 years certain that no one could see them, and built an entire crime on that certainty, and stole a little girl's whole life. And very nearly won. And the only reason they didn't, the only reason a real granddaughter came home and a real criminal was stopped, is that there was one person in the room they never accounted for. The one who couldn't not see. They told me they had found their heir. It was the first lie I caught in that house. It turned out to be the most important one I ever saw, because catching it led me, 30 days later, to the real girl, the true one, the one they had hidden, and home. I have spent my whole life seeing the lies people tell. It took the Ashworths to teach me what the gift was actually for. It was never for watching liars win. It was for bringing the truth home. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Do you think you can tell when someone is lying to you? And subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. I'll see you there.